debate? Well, let's bring in Professor David Phinnemore, an expert in European affairs at Queen's University Belfast. Great to talk to you tonight, Professor. Let's first of all get your sense of how significant you think this moment is.
Well, I think it's very significant because we've had a long period since the UK left the European Union where there's not been a huge amount of interest in closer relations. Under the new government, we've had this very clear reset. There's been plenty of discussions with the European Union on what the future relationship might look like. And we've got to a point today where you've got political agreement on a fairly wide-ranging set of issues on which both sides want to pursue closer cooperation.
What do you make on the different statements we're getting from different sides? And there's two thoughts I've got. My first thought is this: how much of a battle is going on now for narrative control?
I think both sides need to sort of talk to their domestic audiences. The UK wants to address some of the domestic opposition, which is clearly going to exist towards closer relations, because obviously some people say this is a sellout on Brexit. The EU needs to make sure that it is addressing some of the concerns which are being expressed by some of its member states. I think quite a lot of the time the UK domestic debate doesn't necessarily listen to what the Europeans are saying, and the Europeans don't necessarily listen too much to what the domestic debate in the UK is concerned. What really matters is that when those negotiators from both sides get together, they focus on delivering what has been agreed here in terms of the high-level political agreement that we've had for the first time essentially since 2020 when the UK left the EU.
There's a lot of these parts of these several agreements that still have a mark, if you look at the finer detail, and we're still waiting for a lot of detail, it's worth saying, work in progress, particularly when it comes to the idea of youth mobility. It's a bit like Macbeth. It's a word that the Labour Party do not want to use, the government right now, isn't it? They call it the youth experience, not liking the idea of free movement of people. They stay away from that. What's your take on what the significance of that is, and how far away from that it seems to be?
Okay, I think what we've probably seen, or what we've not seen over the last number of months, is the behind the scenes work going on between UK and British officials about working out what can be possibly done in terms of youth mobility. I think what's really important today, and this is the real importance of what's been decided, is that the UK has now signed up at essentially the highest possible political level in terms of relations with the EU to actually try and deliver something on youth mobility. I don't think you'd actually have an agreement today stating that there's a commitment there unless that commitment was genuine. I do actually think the British government has now reached the point where it's willing to essentially take on some of the domestic opposition to this, and basically, as the Prime Minister said today, do this in the best interest of the United Kingdom. That seems to be the position he has now. This is the moment when he's got to essentially ensure that he delivers on what that commitment is, because if he doesn't, not only there's going to be domestic disappointment, but I think there's going to be disappointment on the EU side as well.
So the idea being that there will be youths, in this case under 30s, able to work, to study, to extend, to travel. We're told with caveats, with some limits, again, to make sure that migration is under some control. But again, lots of questions about how that will work. Let me also ask you, in seeing this today, the sense we got from Keir Starmer was it was a win-win, time to move on, forward direction, case closed, wounds healed. Is there a risk this also reopens them all again?
Not necessarily between the UK and the EU. I think that the mood music has changed.
Yes.
Domestically. I think to an extent, yes, but what we've had over the last number of years is a narrative driven by the Brexiteers, where now I think you've got a government in power where broadly it is supported within its own ranks by those who favour a closer relationship with the European Union. The public opinion sentiment is there as well. That said, there are difficulties in terms of managing the opposition in terms of their views. But equally, there's an argument now around that, okay, well, Brexit has been done. The UK government is free now, essentially, to determine what sort of relationship it wants to with the European Union, and I think this does represent a turning point where you probably will see far more engagement by the UK government in delivering what it genuinely, I think, believes is a good deal for the United Kingdom.
And if we look at the idea, the agreement to give European fishermen access to British territorial waters over the course of 12 years. There was some suggestion from Keir Starmer that there might be a number cap. We don't quite know what that is, I don't think, yet. But I think this is quite clearly seen. It was led by coastal states. We believe it was led by France. I think this is President Macron saying thank you for all the fish here, because this is a big issue for them. Do you see this as a French win?
I think if we go back to when the UK left the European Union, there's always a question as to whether it was the French one or the British one. Okay, there's a question of access, which many continental European fishers need, but it's equally in terms of market access, which the UK fishers need. Okay, there's bound to be a trade-off here. It's very, very difficult to quantify winners and losers on this. I think what you've probably got is a degree of stability for both fishers on both sides in terms of access and market access. And that will be, I think, fated as a win by both sides. I think that what we need to do is not to get too distracted by the fishing question, where there is so much more on the table here. Also, it's very difficult at this stage to really have a definitive answer to the question as to who's won, because the detail simply is not known.
Yes.
And that applies to a lot of what's actually been said today.
And to which, I guess, for the UK side, there were some suggestions that they were being held to ransom, particularly from previous Brexiteers, because to get access to part of the Reform Europe defence munitions and armories, 150 billion euros, to get part of access to that, it was seen as a quid pro quo. The other point to mention briefly and finally to you is just the idea of what's happened to our language, what happened to life culturally as well. The Brexit means Brexit thing. I want to quote to you a phenomena in the UK. You might have seen this. It's called the Brexit tackle, where football amateur level, The Guardian have picked this up recently. They call it the Brexit tackle, quote, "It's a deliberate, reckless challenge aimed at taking out an opponent, typically without concern for any potential consequences." And players shout, "Brexit means Brexit." What do you make of that?
It may be a phrase which is being used, but I think from the UK government's perspective, and I think for a significant proportion of society, okay, Brexit has happened. It's had its consequences. Arguably, yes, it's delivered on the referendum result, but equally, here's a time when you want to actually think, hey, what's in the best interest of the United Kingdom? And I think this is where you've now got a government who sees it differently to the previous one and wants to see a closer relationship with the European Union. There's always going to be people who make the claim that Brexit has not actually been fully delivered. But equally, some people need to look back and look at the referendum result. It wasn't that overwhelming in favour of Brexit. And I think there would be some people now who might actually regret the decision they made back in 2016.
Good to get your thoughts tonight. Thank you, David. Professor David Phinnemore, Professor of European Politics at Queen's University. Thank you for your time.